What I'm going to talk about tonight is something that most of us were alive for, and you may have known more about the details in October, but you might not have known the history. And I think it's important to understand the history. First of all, here's an overview of the island, and you can see from the overview how many different medium-range ballistic missiles they had. They also had a number of SAMs. They also had some intermediate range ballistic missiles. So there were a lot of missiles in Cuba. But first, we're going to start with some historical context. Then I'm going to talk about the crisis itself. The crisis itself was 2 weeks in October 1962. Then I'll finish with a little bit of aftermath kind of information. Don't know how much you know about the history of Cuba, so let's start with a Cuban history. Life in Cuba has been erratic since the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War was when the Spanish were evicted from Cuba by the Americans because they sank the Maine, if you'll remember that. Although the Cubans over the last century made great efforts to establish a democratic form of government, they just weren't very good at it. They have periods of representative government, but for the most part, they had one form or another of dictatorship.
Are you muted, Brenda?
In the 30s, there was a revolution led by someone named Fulgencio Batista. His first revolution failed, but that revolution very much led to decades of instability. In March of 1952, Batista, with the army's backing, staged another coup, and that time he seized power and he kept it for about 7 years. He did two things while he was in charge, if you will. First of all, he formed very strong relationships with organized crime in this country. The mafia moved into Cuba. The mafia had a great deal to do with Cuban operation of casinos and whatnot. The second thing that he did was he formed a lot of relationships with American companies. For instance, the corporation that I work for, Procter & Gamble, had a number of facilities in Cuba. Batista himself, and the reason that he did so well was he was very strongly anti-communist. The US government supported him, despite the fact that he was functioning as a dictator. And he turned the country into a police state. So by the late 50s, Cuba was ripe for what followed next. But before we go into Cuban history any further, I thought we'd take a step back and talk about when the Cuban Missile Crisis really started. It started in October of 1957 with Sputnik. It was the first artificial satellite launched into an Earth orbit, and it was launched by the Soviet Union in October of 1957. Those of us who were around in the late 50s can remember how surprised the American population was. That satellite, and really more than just the satellite, but what it represented, precipitated an American Sputnik crisis. It surprised the American public. Up until then, the United States, as we perceived it, was the sole superpower. The Soviet Union was little more than a backward country, even though they had exploded an atom bomb. Eisenhower, on the other hand, he was the president, was not surprised by Sputnik. He had been forewarned with information from U-2 spy planes. Their administration's response was low key. He did not make a big deal out of it. The government did not, on the surface, seem to be overly concerned. However, the Senate, chaired by Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson, remember him, had a 6-week meeting of the Preparedness Investigating Subcommittee. That led to the formation of NASA. The space race was on, and the Jupiter missile, I don't know how many of you remember Jupiter missiles, took center stage. What was the Jupiter missile? It was a 1,500-mile range, intermediate range ballistic missile. A problem that came up very quickly from the space race was fighting between the Army and the Air Force. They both wanted to be in the missile business, and there was a lot of duplication of effort. In March of 1957, the first Jupiter missile was launched at Cape Canaveral, capable of delivering a nuclear warhead. And if you look at it and don't think about the material down at the bottom of it, what it was a second generation V2. First generation was something called Redstone. These rockets were developed by Wernher von Braun of V2 fame. Jupiter itself was originally designed by the Army. They were looking for a missile to strike targets like bridges, railway yards, troop concentrations, and the like. They were not looking at nuclear targets as they developed it. In April of 1958, just a year later, the Department of Defense notified the Air Force that it was planning to deploy the first 3 Jupiter squadrons, 45 missiles, in France. And they were going to be under the auspice of the U.S. Air Force with some level of French operation. Charles de Gaulle refused to accept any Jupiter missiles in France. De Gaulle did not ever get along real well with the United States. He did not see the benefits. In fact, it wasn't too long after this that NATO was kicked out of Paris and moved to Brussels. And I don't remember exactly when that happened. Meanwhile, in Cuba, we're in the late 50s, uncertainty became turmoil. A man named Fidel Castro emerged. Castro was born a bastard in 1926, the son of a Spanish-American War veteran. In 1945, he was studying law, but admitted that he was politically illiterate. He was very active in student activities. He was the leader of a failed effort to overthrow Trujillo. Trujillo was the dictator before Batista in 1945. He failed, by the way. He subsequently went to Colombia. He led another failed revolution. So as a fairly young man, he was still in his 20s, Castro was very active in revolution in various places. After Batista seized power, remember that was in the early 50s, he then formed a resistance cell in Cuba to resist Batista. He was put in prison in 1953 by Batista. While he was there, he studied Marx and other communist works. I don't understand exactly why, but Batista let him out in 1955. In 1956, he started guerrilla war on Batista. Within 2 years, Batista abdicated. And I remember I was at Georgia Tech in 1958, and there were a lot of Cuban students there running around in fatigues, talking about Castro was coming. He was going to change life in Cuba. They were going to get rid of all the bad guys, yada, yada. That was in 58. And by 59, Castro had seized the government of Cuba. Initially, he was hailed as a hero, but he almost immediately turned to the USSR for support. In 1960, he agreed to buy oil from the Soviet Union. The next thing he did was nationalize the oil refineries. He nationalized the corporations that I'd been talking about before that were in Cuba, including the Procter & Gamble facilities. I do not believe there was any compensation for the businesses they took over. At that time, the United States broke off diplomatic relations with Cuba, 1960. Now, here's some things that were going on in the early 60s. In May, a U-2 on surveillance mission over the Soviet Union was shot down, the Francis Gary Powers incident. That immediately caused a huge disruption with the Soviet Union. It led to the cancellation of the Paris Summit on Disarmament. Khrushchev stormed out of the meeting in Paris.
And George, I don't know if this is appropriate, but I have a personal recollection on that. Can you hear me? I was aboard the USS Independence at that time, working in communications. And the plan was that Eisenhower was going to take the USS Northampton to France for the summit with Khrushchev. So they moved all their communications equipment from ComSecond Fleet, flagship was the Northampton, put it in our comm spaces. So we were kind of doubled up there for several weeks. On May 1st, when the U-2 was shot down, the trip was canceled, or at least his trip on the Northampton was canceled. And he actually flew to Paris to have a short meeting with Khrushchev. But so the ComSecond Fleet all went back to the Northampton, and we were kind of back to normal. But it was pretty crowded there for a while with extra staff and extra comms and so forth. And at one time, I'm sitting there by myself in the crypto center, and I get a message over the teletop. Can you accept top secret code word? And wait a minute, I'm not cleared for that. So I had to go find an officer to come in and take the message. But that's a personal recollection of what happened at that point.
Well, it produced a very unsettled situation. In September of the same year, Castro came to the General Assembly of the United Nations, and he made a 4.5-hour speech denouncing American policies towards Latin America. Castro was clearly establishing himself as an adversary of America. In April of 61, 6 months later, Kennedy authorized the Cuban exiles to storm the beaches at the Bay of Pigs. Their intent was to ignite an uprising to overthrow Castro. As we all know, the Bay of Pigs was a disaster. In November of the same year, and I want to talk about this a bit more, a CIA committee initiated a further program of terrorism, sabotage, and subversion against Cuba. It was something called Operation Mongoose. Their objective was to overthrow Castro. Operation Mongoose was not a clandestine, underneath the table organization. It was an official American sanctioned program. So I want to talk about Operation Mongoose. And someone named Edwin Lansdale Some of you may remember him, and I'll talk a little bit more about him later. Operation Mongoose was a campaign of terrorists with covert operations carried out officially by the CIA. It was officially authorized in November by John Kennedy. Its objective was to remove Castro from power. That was a prime focus of Kennedy's administration. It was led by this man named Edwin Lansdale. He was an Air Force general, but if you look at his career, it doesn't make sense to me how he became a major general. He had served in the OSS in World War II, spent most of his career in the CIA. If you'll remember, he was the person who led the Diem coup in Vietnam in 1963. The primary focus of Mongoose was the assassination of Castro and guerrilla attacks on military objectives. They made numerous, some of them almost funny, assassination efforts. None of them failed. Among other things, they included the mafia in their efforts. Kennedy was not impressed with the CIA's performance in Operation Mongoose. Now, a little bit about John Kennedy. He was the 35th president of the United States. You can see how old he was when he was elected. He was 44 years old. What he did as far as the service is concerned was he tried to go to OCS in the Army, but he was medically disqualified because of his lower back problems. With the help of the director of the Office of Naval Intelligence, and you can read into that his father's influence, he joined the United States Naval Reserve. He was commissioned an ensign in October of 1941. In April of 43, he took command of PT-109. It was sunk in what could be called questionable circumstances. After he was sunk and after he escaped with his troops, he was in a hospital, and there were two separate activities going on at the same time. The Navy wanted to court-martial him, and his father wanted him to get the Medal of Honor. They compromised. He got the Silver Star, and the court-martial quietly went away. His political career, again with the support of his father's money and influence, included 6 years in the House of Representatives and 6 years in the Senate. He was elected president in 1960. His foreign policy was dominated by confrontation with the Soviet Union, manifested by proxy kinds of contests. He didn't directly confront the Soviet Union. His decisions on Cuba and Vietnam have haunted his legacy ever since. Now, the provocation. In late 1961, after the Bay of Pigs, the U.S. moved Jupiter ballistic missiles into Italy and Turkey. 3 Jupiter squadrons on NATO's southern flank. And a squadron had 15 of these Jupiter missiles. This was part of the U.S. response to the challenges raised by Sputnik and what they perceived to be developing Soviet capability to produce intercontinental ballistic missiles. The U.S. accelerated plans to deploy weapons in NATO and develop programs to train Allied forces in their use. So the idea in Italy and in Turkey was that the Turks and the Italians were actually going to be operating these missiles. The American forces who were with them would retain control of the nuclear warheads. State Department officials weren't real pleased with this idea, especially with regard to Turkey. Kennedy and McNamara approved moving these Jupiter missiles into Turkey. To state the missiles would represent a standing commitment which could not easily be recalled if a Turkish government that was irresponsible came into power. It would give Turkey more or less continuing power to start war by firing these IR intermediate range ballistic missiles in haste or in error. This action put American nuclear missiles within range of Moscow. At the date, 1961, it was 1,000 miles to Moscow from where these missiles were sighted. Again, Nikita Khrushchev was incensed. I call this the provocation. Don't know if you know much about Mr. Khrushchev. He was the first secretary of the Communist Party for 11 years. When Germany invaded Russia in 1941, he was at his post in Kiev. Stalin appointed him a political commissar, and a commissar's role was between the military commanders and the political rulers in Moscow. This was in the 40s. By March 1953, Khrushchev was part of the inner circle around Stalin. Stalin suffered a huge stroke. While the doctors were trying to treat him, Khrushchev and the rest of the inner circle were engaged in discussion about how the new government was going to operate. On March the 5th, Stalin died. Very soon, Beria was arrested. Following work done by Khrushchev and his allies, he was tried in secret and executed. With that, Nikita was in power. Under Khrushchev, the Soviet Union actually started to loosen up. The special tribunals that were operated by the security agencies were abolished. By their standards, a thaw was in progress. He considered John Kennedy a likely partner for détente. The missile crisis found him conflicted. 2 years later, he was ousted as first secretary. I'm going to digress a little bit. I think several of you have talked about a movie called The Courier. It's an interesting story. Meanwhile, this is back in the early 60s, an unassuming British businessman named Greville Wynne was recruited into one of the great international conflicts in history. This is a movie, and if you ever get a chance to see it, I think you'd enjoy it. At the behest of MI6 and a CIA operative, he formed a covert partnership with a Soviet officer named Oleg Penkovsky. Penkovsky was a top Soviet military intelligence officer who was disillusioned with the Soviet system. Penkovsky wanted to tell the West whatever they wanted to know about the USSR's most closely held secrets. Over a number of months, he was passing Greville Wynne information of a highly secret nature. From Wynne, it went to MI6. From MI6, it went to the CIA. He is the person with the intelligence that was needed to alert the Allies to the Cuban missiles. He provoked the Cuban Missile Crisis. A U-2 flight confirmed it, but they got their basic information via this man. Both of them were captured in May of 1963. Penkovsky was executed in the Lubyanka prison. Later, Wynne was exchanged for a Soviet spy in 1964. Now, the Cuban missiles themselves. Beginning in the summer of '62, the Soviets started shipping combat troops to Cuba aboard a fleet of ships. The CIA, when they finally took a guess at what was going on, now we're back to October of 62, they thought there were 6,000 to 8,000 Soviet troops in Cuba. Actually, there were 43,000 USSR troops in Cuba at that time. Specialists in missile construction under the guise of machine operators, irrigation specialists, and agricultural specialists started arriving in July. The first consignment of R-12 missiles arrived September the 8th, followed by a second on September the 16th. R-12 was a medium-range ballistic missile capable of carrying a thermonuclear warhead. So in September, the missiles were installed. On October the 14th, a U-2 identified the missile sites. On the 15th, Kennedy was notified. The official analysis indicated that the sites were under construction. That is not correct. By that time, the missiles were operational. So when we found out about it, the missiles were set up and ready to go. Now, this is the propaganda that immediately followed our discovery of what was going on. You can see that a number of those distances are beyond the range of an intermediate range ballistic missile. Washington, D.C., on the other hand, was out at the extreme edge of its range. But that's what was being used in the United States to create the kind of trouble that was about to follow. What was America's initial reaction? October the 16th, Kennedy met with something called XCOM to discuss how are we going to respond to the threat. XCOM is not the cabinet. It's the National Security Advisor. It's the Secretary of Defense and State. It's the Attorney General, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and other strap hangers. That's who met to decide what to do about it. McNamara gave JFK three options. Option one is diplomacy with Castro and Khrushchev. Option two was a naval blockade of Cuba. Option three was an air attack to destroy the missile sites. The concern about the air attack was it might, and at that time they thought they were missile sites. They did not realize they were active missile capabilities. But they were a little bit reluctant because of predicted a Soviet counterattack on some place like Berlin. McNamara favored option two. Kennedy agreed to a quarantine to buy time to negotiate withdrawal of the missiles. They were careful to call it a quarantine because a blockade is considered an act of war. Now, what did our military do in that time? On October the 21st, we deployed RF-101s and RB-66s to MacDill Air Force Base from Shaw Air Force Base, the entire 363rd Tactical Reconnaissance Wing. SAC continued U-2 missions. They maintained 60 nuclear-armed bombers on airborne alert and placed all ICBMs on alert to launch at any moment. TAC presence in Florida increased from 140 fighters to 500 fighters, 72 reconnaissance aircraft with 40 tankers. The mobilization took place in 2 weeks, turned much of southern Florida into a D-Day-like staging area. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were placed on alert for immediate movement to intermediate staging areas in southern Florida. They also moved medium and heavy bombers to the southeast, along with 2,000 Marines and tons of equipment to Guantanamo Bay. We were getting ready to invade. And what was that invasion going to look like? It would begin with airstrikes. As soon as command and control and anti-ship defenses were neutered, warships would attack. SEAL teams would support the capture of the ports with Army Special Forces, and they'd disarm radar station and SAM sites. The 82nd and 101st Airborne were to jump in, followed by a brigade of the 1st Armored and the 1st Airborne, or the 1st Infantry Division. It was going to look an awful lot like D-Day at Omaha and Utah beaches. Almost the same group of people. The 2nd Marine Division would then land and push inland, followed by the Army's 2nd Infantry Division. We were coming in whole hog. Sink-Lant expected resistance to end within 18 days. That's Op Plan 316. That was the planned invasion of of Cuba in October of 1962. Now, what actually happened next was Kennedy went on the air on national television and revealed unmistakable evidence of the missile threat. Announced that the United States, I can remember being told that the idea was to prevent the ships that were carrying the weapons themselves from reaching Cuba. At the same time demanding that the Soviets withdraw their missiles. He had a separate speech drafted also that said, "This morning I reluctantly ordered the armed forces to attack and destroy the nuclear buildup." That was the address that John Kennedy never delivered. Now here's an interesting set of sequences. In a letter to Khrushchev, Kennedy wrote Khrushchev, "You might not understand the determination of the United States, since I have not assumed that you or any other sane man would plunge this war into war. No country would win it. The consequences to the whole world would be staggering. And that includes the aggressor." That's the letter he sent to Khrushchev on the 22nd. On the 23rd, Khrushchev then wrote a letter to Kennedy, rebuffing his demand that the Soviets remove the missiles. The Soviet leader insisted they are intended solely for defensive purposes. Kennedy replied in another letter, reminding Khrushchev that he started the crisis by secretly sending missiles to Cuba. Whereas when we sent our missiles to Turkey, it wasn't a secret. Or at least that's the narrative. On October the 25th, Ambassador Adlai Stevenson explained the matter to the UN. He confronted Valerian Zorin with photographic evidence and demanded that he admit the Soviet deployment of missiles in Cuba. At the same time, U.S. ships moved into position. Submarines from the Soviet Union moved into the Caribbean as well. However, Soviet freighters bearing additional military supplies stopped in their tracks. And I can remember watching on television as they showed these freighters turning around and heading back to the Soviet Union. But it wasn't quite over. On October the 26th, Castro sent a letter to Khrushchev asking him to launch a nuclear strike against the United States. Khrushchev disregarded that letter. Instead, Khrushchev sent a letter to Kennedy saying, "Let's not doom the world to the catastrophe of thermonuclear war." On October the 27th, a U-2 was shot down over Cuba. War seemed imminent. Paul Nietzsche, the Secretary of Defense, said they fired the first shot. By the way, at that time, the authority to use the nuclear weapons had been delegated to the troops on the ground. They did not have to be told by Khrushchev to fire. However, they did not fire them. Kennedy concluded that Khrushchev had not himself given the order to shoot down the U-2. The incident prompted both leaders to realize that the situation was getting out of control. Same day, Khrushchev sent another letter to Kennedy, demanding that the U.S. withdraw missiles from Turkey as a key part of resolving the standoff. Now, the resolution of it. Robert McNamara, the 8th United States Secretary of Defense, he was a supporter of the blockade, but he was against military action against the Soviets or the Cubans. On October the 28th, Khrushchev conceded the Soviet missiles would be dismantled. The White House portrayed the withdrawal as the consequence of Kennedy's tough stance. But however, in reality, the crisis was averted because the U.S. secretly pledged to withdraw the intermediate range ballistic missiles from Turkey, and they also pledged not to invade Cuba. Kennedy was providing secret assurances to Khrushchev about the Jupiters, but few people outside the deal, and that included the NATO countries, knew what was going on. They learned nothing of it at the time. McNamara then argued that the Americans were doing the Turks a favor by removing obsolete weapons, replacing them with submarine-launched Polaris missiles in the Med. Little sidebar on Polaris. Polaris missile was a two-stage, solid-fuel, nuclear-armed, submarine-launched ballistic missile. It served from 1960 to 1980. It had a range of 1,400 miles, marginally in range of Moscow from the Caribbean. The USS George Washington, which was launched in 1960 with missiles, was the first ballistic missile submarine. She and all other Polaris subs carried 16 missiles. The use of Polaris as a primary deterrent during the Cold War was in competition with the Air Force Jupiter. My missile is better than your missile. Polaris were replaced by Poseidon missiles, or they started to replace them, in 1971. Poseidon missiles had a range of 2,900 miles. Poseidon was subsequently replaced by the Trident missile with a range of 4,000 miles in 1990. Aftermath. The U.S. military remained on high alert for 3 more weeks as it monitored the removal of the missiles. Kennedy was satisfied with Soviet assurances with all nuclear weapons had been removed. He lifted the blockade on November the 20th, 1962. However, Khrushchev hadn't taken all of the nuclear weapons out. He had dismantled the medium and intermediate range missiles, but he left 100 tactical nuclear weapons, of which the Americans were unaware, for possible use in repelling any invading U.S. forces. The Soviets finally removed the last of the nuclear warheads from Cuba on December the 1st, 1962. Outcomes of the crisis. It actually strengthened Kennedy's image domestically. It mitigated the Bay of Pigs invasion. And as I said, nobody knew about the Turkish missiles for quite some time. I can't remember when I learned about it, but it was a long time after 1962. In addition, because of the communications, remember I talked about letters being flown back and forth? The leaders struggled to understand each other's intentions while the world hung on the brink of possible nuclear war, while letters were being written between the leaders. In an effort to prevent this from happening again, a telephone link between the White House and the Kremlin was put in place called the hotline. Both superpowers began to reconsider the nuclear arms race, and they took the first steps in agreeing to a nuclear test ban treaty. Closure. In November of '63, 1 year later, Kennedy was assassinated. More than a few people have ascribed his assassination to the mafia and/or anti-Castro Cubans and/or disaffected Vietnamese, any one of whom had a pretty good reason for assassinating Kennedy. I've also read a book where Johnson is alleged to have been responsible for Kennedy's assassination. In 1967, 4 years later, the CIA Inspector General, at the request of Johnson, issued a 133-page report on the plots to assassinate Fidel Castro. The report separates the plots into several different time frames, starting with prior to August of '60 and ending with late 1962 until well into 1963. It confirms that there are no official records that were kept regarding the planning, the authorization, or the implementation of any of these plots. All of the information that went into this report was derived from oral testimony collected years after the plots were originally planned. Fidel Castro died of old age in 2016. He was 80 years old. Cuba is still a communist country. In 2016, Cuba requested foreign aid from Russia. In particular, what they wanted was cheap oil. In February last month, Cuba did not condemn Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. They affirmed that the armed incursion is justified for reasons of security. And now you know more about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Comments, questions, thoughts?
George, I was told that many years later, the generals from the USA and Soviet Union got together at, I can't remember what country, and they all said that World War III was very, very close.
No doubt about it. How many troops